Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 2, Day 1. Today we'll be beginning our new unit on the American Revolution, and we're going to start off today talking a little bit about taxes. So for your first journal, you need to answer this question: do you think we should have to pay taxes? If not, why? If so, how should we collect taxes? What things should we tax? Those are the questions I want you to think about. Should be able to go very in depth with this. I want you to think about how taxes influence your own life, what taxes actually go towards and what they help, and things of that nature. All right? Now, today we're starting the French and Indian War. This is Unit 2, Day 1, so we are starting a brand new unit today. Our essential question for the day: what events led to the French and Indian War, and then how did the French and Indian War and other British actions create discontent among the colonists in the 13 original colonies? So that's what we want to try to talk about today. Okay, and we want to identify the major causes of the French and Indian War and the geographic results from the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War was a war between the British and the French. It was fought in North America over territorial disputes, specifically the Ohio River Valley. And what happens here is that the French had occupied much of Canada, and there were those who were in the colonies who wanted all of the Ohio River Valley because they felt like it was their land, and the French had already made claims to much of that territory and a lot of the territory that ran along the Mississippi River. I'll have a map for you here in a second, but France had a huge portion of land, and the territorial disputes between the English and the French were very vast in that regard. When it came down to it, the colonists ended up fighting on the British side, and the Native Americans, hoping that their good relationship with the French that had been built would hopefully maybe lead to them having more rights in this country, ended up kind of backfiring on them, but they thought by joining the French it would help them. So they end up fighting alongside the French. Now, our first skirmish was along the Ohio River Valley, and both sides start constructing these forts, trying to make their blockade, or whatever you want to call it, to prepare to fight the enemy. And George Washington is actually going to be involved in one of the very first battles against the French in these forts, and he tries to attack one of the French forts. I can't think of the name at the moment, but he's going to lead a force that, their goal was to try to expel the French early on, push them back. George Washington ends up being forced to surrender, but because of his courage and his willingness to attack it without regard for his own life, he gains a ton of fame here. And it's important to note this, not so much because of George Washington attacking this French fort, but more so the fact that George Washington was just involved in the battle, and this is going to lead to him gaining tons of notoriety towards becoming a president eventually, and a huge leader among those involved in the Revolutionary War. He's also very young during this point in time in his life. He's going to end up being president in 1789, so he's 36 years from the presidency at the end of this war. So he's not an old man by no means, but there's a lot of living that he's getting ready to do over the course of the next few years. So, the French and Indian War continues, and the colonists, they are concerned about where they stand in this war and how this war actually is somewhat their problem, because in their eyes, they were fighting this war with the British, but some colonists didn't believe that they should have any involvement at all. And so that's going to lead to what we call the Albany Conference. And the idea of the Albany Conference was twofold. Number one, they wanted to attempt to align with the Iroquois Indians, who we talked about very early in this class in Unit 1, that was one of the larger Native American groups in New York and that area. The Iroquois refused the colonial alliance, but they do promise that they will remain neutral, which at least in some ways helped the colonists to know that they weren't going to have to fight those Native Americans. However, there's a ton of Native American forces on the other side in Canada and in various parts of North America that have joined and are fighting alongside the French. The colonies do agree to appoint one supreme commander of all the British troops, which ends up being Edward Braddock. And Edward Braddock is George Washington's commander. The other thing, and this is the second part of the Albany Conference, and this is the important thing that you need to note, we have the Albany Plan of Union. And the Albany Plan of Union was proposed by Benjamin Franklin, and it was just a plan for the colonies to form their own federal government in order to, one, protect them from, attacks from another country. Also, the fact that they needed leadership directly there in the country that could respond and react to attacks such as this without having to get, approval from the king or whatever. The other idea was that they needed to join together because they were stronger together than they were if they were separated. The plan's rejected, but it is one of the first signs that we see of the colonies beginning to think of themselves joining for a common defense. Now, George Washington emerges a hero while he's fighting in the French and Indian War. Forces ambushed him outside of a British fort, Fort Duquesne, and his chief general is killed. And so George Washington is forced to retreat his men and ends up saving his men by organizing them behind him in some way, and retreated, and none of them died, and he did not die. But somehow he had 4 bullet holes in his hat and his clothes that had somehow passed through him, but he had not gotten hit. Which leads to this idea that George Washington is bulletproof and is only going to start to grow his legend even more throughout this war. Now, the British are eventually successful. We're not going to go into any of the specific battles. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. But the British Navy cuts off the French supply line and in the north, and are able to basically make it to where they can't get any more supplies to keep fighting through the rivers in Canada or the tributaries there through North America. The French are also badly outnumbered, especially once the Native American forces begin to end their attacks. And what happened was the American forces, or the British forces, I should say at this time, they really focused their attacks on the Native Americans. And when the Native Americans saw how badly they were being attacked, they just kind of backed out of it. And so the British are actually able to seize the French capital of Quebec. And this is going to lead to the first Treaty of Paris. There are 2. Okay, make sure you know both. The second one we will talk about at the end of the Revolution. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the French and Indian War, and it said that all French territory east of the Mississippi River would now be a part of the British Empire. The problem here is that they're not going to allow all that land to be given to colonists, but we'll get to that. In 1763, we have some big issues on hand. Number one, we just got done fighting a war that many colonists weren't sure was their responsibility. But now, Britain is in a ton of debt as a result of this war, that they're losing money from the colonies because of all the money they had to throw at this war. And now they want to force the colonists to pay through taxes for all of these debts. And that's not going to work out so well, because it starts to build resentment in the colonies, and the colonists feel like they shouldn't have to pay. They shouldn't have to pay for a war that they didn't even support. That it was only the British government are the ones who wanted the land. So, for your questions today, just kind of going to review a few things, because I do want you to consider what we talked about in Unit 1. What series of laws were passed by the British in order to try to limit trade in the colonies? Okay, I want you to think about back to Unit 1, something we talked about that was trying to limit trade in the colonies and trying to make sure that they got their cut. What is the significance of Bacon's Rebellion? Who emerged as the hero of the French and Indian War? And what is the lasting impact of the British victory on colonial America? Okay, and then you only got 2 vocab words to start out the day. So a very, very easy start for you for the unit. Please let me know if you have any problems, and I'll talk to you soon.